Good morning. It is Monday, the 29th of July, and this is The Drill. Good morning. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America today, because I'm the only one that knows that being a true conservative is about common sense. My podcast is about demonstrating how to beat the left each and every day. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. And I want to welcome my latest YouTube subscriber, Chidike Uday. And so I have a total of 8 subscribers on YouTube now. And so my email address is storytimes@hotmail.com, or you can also reach me at Gmail. And I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hardgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. So I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican. And I was taught by the left that I was a conservative because of where I stood on the issues, which sounded reasonable. But whenever I engaged a liberal in debate, I couldn't win. So I soon figured out that the issues, as they were delineated by the left, were a trap. And the issues were created by the left for the left. So is there any way for a conservative to win? Yes. But first you have to redefine what it means to be a conservative. And by becoming a true conservative, one will not only win, but never lose. The purpose of my broadcast is to demonstrate how to defeat the left each and every day. So this morning I was listening to, one of the things I do is I listen to the broadcasts of various pundits, Hugh Hewitt and Glenn Beck, and then I listen to Rush Limbaugh, then a little bit of Sean Hannity, and I also listen sometimes to Dennis Prager. And I also listen to some people in the evenings. There's a guy on, a couple of guys on in the evening. But anyways, I listen to a variety of right-wing broadcasts. I'm listening to see whether or not they're doing it right or they're doing it wrong. The number one thing that the pundits get wrong is dealing with arbitrary statements. They honor arbitrary statements that have no evidence or any proof to them. Bernie Sanders, this morning I was listening to Hugh Hewitt, and Bernie Sanders, he played a clip of Bernie Sanders making comments about his plans, his program, he's running for president of the United States and what it is that he exactly wants to do. Well, the interviewer that was interviewing Bernie Sanders in this particular clip asked Bernie Sanders, well, gee, is it fair to give things free to billionaires, to people that are like free medical care, or I think actually the way the question was it was having to do with wiping out student loans and student debt, and asking Bernie Sanders, is it fair to ask the rich kids, the children of the rich, or people that are rich themselves, is it fair to wipe out their debt? And instead of answering the question, the obvious answer to that question is no, it's not fair. But instead of answering the question, he dismissed it. He says, well, there aren't very many rich kids that have that kind of a problem. They can take care of it or whatever. He just brushed it aside and then went on to say that the vast majority are brown-skinned people who are oppressed by these debts. We told them to go to school, they go to school, and then they find themselves oppressed by debt. And the interviewer didn't at the end of this thing make note of that, which is what he should have done. Nobody, when you're doing an interview, shouldn't be arguing with the people you're interviewing. You're not there to engage them in a debate or engage them in any type of argument. You ask the questions, they answer it or don't answer it, and then at the end of the interview, you can talk to your audience and make note of it. Hey, Mr. Sanders did not answer, or he brushed aside my question, and make note of it that way. And so Mr. Hugh Hewitt went ahead and he played this clip, and then he says, This is a clip of Bernie Sanders saying that talking about the fairness of doing away with student loans, and then he asked his viewers or listeners to call in and ask them, "What do you think?" And this is again where Mr. Hewitt gets it wrong. One of the other big mistakes that the left makes, or the right makes, is in failing to make distinctions. Too often the right wants to pretend that they're neutral. And that's what Mr. Hewitt is doing in this particular case. Instead of instantly making a value judgment and saying what Mr. Hewitt should have done is say, Bernie Sanders was wrong to brush aside the question. And that the obvious answer to the question is, no, it's not fair. Now, maybe Bernie Sanders has reasons why he still thinks it's a good idea, even though it's not fair to liquidate the debts of the rich. That question also applies, by the way, to single-payer health care. Why should Donald Trump get free health care? Is that fair? Is it fair that Donald Trump people like Donald Trump get free health care when they're billionaires? No, it isn't. Simple answer to that question. So the idea that we're going to go ahead and create a single-payer system as a matter of fairness is a crock. But moving on. The point is that Hugh Hewitt at that point should have said Bernie Sanders was wrong to blow off the question. The right answer to that question is that it is unfair to go ahead and let the rich off the hook, so to speak. And furthermore, we conservatives are better than that. We're better when we're interviewed. We have the answers to questions. We don't just brush off questions with an attitude. We give answers to questions. We do research. We think about policies ahead of time. And we do not assume that things are preordained or that they are destined to occur the way the left does. We don't, it's not us. We were raised better. We're better people. We're better politically than they are. That's the kind of statement that Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, etc., or et al. Should be making. You've got to make the distinction. Make the point. Because that's why they're there, ostensibly. Sean Hannity bragging the other day, saying, well, I'm not a Republican. I'm a conservative. And he means not only in terms of philosophically, political philosophy, but in terms of how he registers to vote. He registered to vote with the Conservative Party. So, but he doesn't. He fails the same way Rush Limbaugh does in making the distinctions, in coming out and saying that conservatives would never act like this, or would never act. Let's look at Antifa, for example. That's the Antifa is an organization of the left, and it should be noted every time that Antifa goes out and misbehaves that this is a good reason for people to become conservative, because conservatives would never act like this. Conservatives would never go out and destroy people's property and commit felonies allegedly in the name of political protest. Okay, we're better people than that, and we're better politically than the left, and that people should be becoming, anybody that's right-thinking, anybody that has any sense of morals, should become a conservative. Then on the Glenn Beck show, he has a couple of sidekicks on his show. One is a guy named Jeff, and another one named Stu. But they're always referred to as Stewie and Jeffy. And so one of the mistakes that Glenn Beck makes all the time is in confusing his listeners, because on the one hand, he will come at you with a sense of urgency. The world is on fire. Conservatives are being shut down in terms of free speech on YouTube and on Facebook, and it's urgent, and I need your support, and blah, blah, blah. But then he refers to his staff members as Jeffy and Stewie and Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So am I listening to a serious political broadcast, or am I listening to Disney, or am I listening to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Sesame Street? Why should I take him seriously? And so much of what we're talking about here is about credibility and integrity You maintain your integrity, you'll have credibility. If you have credibility, you can influence people. You can influence people. So that's the point. And there's a lot of influence that Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity et al. Could have culturally and politically in this country if they would simply get their act together. But anyways, so Stewie is taking over for Glenn Beck this week because he's on vacation. And he was talking about and I actually played a clip of Congressman Tlaib, who I don't know what district she's from, but she was quoted as saying that President Trump has a hate agenda, and I believe she did flat out come out and call him a racist. It's still an arbitrary statement, but at least she came right out and called him a racist. Versus it was Kamala Harris the other day that said that there is a predator in the White House. But she didn't say who the predator was, because she's hoping that the audience is going to go ahead and read between the lines and figure out that she's talking about President Trump, I suppose, and then come to his aid, and by coming to his aid, confirm what she has basically suggested in the first place. But anyhow, so Ms. Tlaib comes out and calls him a racist and basically says he has a hate agenda. Now, Stewie initially and immediately gets it right. He says, look, nobody is required to prove a negative. Okay, Donald Trump is not required to prove that he's not a racist. The burden of proof is on the left to prove that, to provide evidence and then proof that he is a racist. So he got that part right. Then he goes on he should have just left it there and then explained that the statement is arbitrary, therefore, since she didn't produce any evidence, and so since it's arbitrary, we must ignore it. Because if you don't ignore arbitrary statements, you look like somebody that has a guilty conscience. Okay, there's a lot of people on the right that think they have to fight every single statement the left puts out. No. What you have to do is listen, read carefully, and determine which statements are worth fighting and which statements are arbitrary. The arbitrary ones you ignore, and you fight the ones in which some evidence has allegedly been produced. If somebody come out and say, well, I know that President Trump is a racist because I have pictures of him at a KKK rally. They've produced some evidence. Now that's something you can fight. You can inquire as to when the picture was taken. You can inquire as to where the picture was taken. And you can possibly say, well, that picture is not of Donald Trump because, and we know it for sure because Donald Trump was at a different location at that date and time. Okay, so now you have something that you can deal with. But if somebody just comes out and calls him, or anyone calls you, maybe you're going to be, as if you're a conservative and you're at work and somebody decides to call you a racist. Hey, did you vote for Donald Trump? Well, yes, I did. Well, you're a racist. Well, that's an arbitrary statement. Now, you can do several things. Well, first thing you can do is just flat out ignore it. The other thing you can do is ask them the question, really, how so? And you'll never get an answer. Remember, one of the key things to remember with the left is that they're always bluffing. Bluffing means that you pretend to have information you don't really have. To have information, to have power, etc., that you don't really have. The left doesn't want to do research. They're not interested in that. They're interested in magic. They're interested in using psychological tools and techniques to manipulate, bully, and intimidate. Very often they use tone of voice to do that. So they'll make a statement that, and use the word disgusting a lot. It's disgusting. And they'll say it with this tone of voice that makes them sound like they're absolutely outraged. And when, as a matter of fact, they're not. They're baiting you. Don't take the bait. If you read and have any familiarity at all with Saul Alinsky and his rules for radicals, he talks about the cycle of reaction. where you provoke your opponents, get a reaction from your opponents, and then re-provoke and keep that cycle going. And the idea is that the cycle becomes more and more intense until you set off some type of conflagration, a revolution, a civil war, something of that nature. So Stewie, like I said, he initially got it right. If he had just made note of the fact that it was an arbitrary statement and stopped there, he would have done it perfectly. But he didn't. Part of it is the pressure. He's on, Glenn Beck's on for 3 hours, so there's the pressure to fill airtime. But he should have show prep. If he'd prepped for this, and the other part of it, I think, is just a little bit of not knowing or ignorance. And so if you know better, and in your show prep, you realize this is going to be very quick. I'm just going to go in there, I'm going to say it's arbitrary, and then I'm going to move on to the next issue. So that's the way it should be done. So back in a minute. Thank you. Welcome back. I wanted to make note, by the way, that some good news. One of the other things that the right could do better is in promoting and celebrating good news. There's plenty of good news out there for conservatives. You don't know about it because nobody seems to want to talk about it. And so I want to celebrate the fact that in a 5-4 split decision in the Supreme Court, President Trump was told by the Supreme Court that they overruled the lower courts that said that Donald Trump or President Trump cannot use $2.5 billion from the military to build the wall. Now he's in a bit of a jam because he has to get that money spent by, I believe it's the end of September, because that's when the fiscal year ends. And once the fiscal year ends, that money goes away. So he's kind of under the gun here. But it's good news anyways. It's still good news. 5-4 decision along party lines. Well, or the way I like to put it is that 5 people that are right-thinking and 4 lefties. Because that's what the left wants to do. They want to load up the Supreme Court with people that are ideologues, that are going to approach jurisprudence from the standpoint of ideology, that they're going to make their rulings not according to the Constitution, but according to Marxist doctrine or socialist doctrine. So, but anyways, it was a 5-4 victory, and good for President Trump. Excellent. So hopefully he can get some more of the wall built pretty soon. There was the other day 11 more miles that were added to the wall in, I believe, Southern California. So that's good news. And also more good news. Apparently, the Trump administration has made a deal with Guatemala that they are going to, for people that want asylum in Guatemala, they're going to have to make their applications in Guatemala instead of having to go all the way to the border and creating problems at the border. So that's a good thing. Also, that apparently the deal that was made with the Mexican government is working, that the Mexican government is, in fact, with their new National Guard, preventing and stopping new immigrants from coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. Notice that I said immigrants, and that's what all conservatives should do. All conservatives should say immigrant and emigrant. Emigration is leaving a country. Immigration is coming into a country. And we use those terms instead of migration. Animals migrate. People emigrate and immigrate. The difference is property. Animals don't own property. They have no property rights. Human beings do own property, have property rights, and therefore and in respect to an acknowledgement of that property and those property rights, we use the term emigrate and immigrate. But this is again a case where the left is trying to use an anti-concept, migration, to obliterate the use of legitimate concepts, immigration and emigration. And they think that if people always talk about or refuse to talk about immigration and emigration, they will refuse to consider the underlying concepts of nationhood, statehood, and the underlying concepts of property and property rights. Unfortunately, I don't think you're going to be able to get rid of people's desire for and expectation of privacy, which is the root of property or private property. The reason we have private property is because we have expectations of privacy. So, but good news that the Mexican government is going ahead and stopping the immigrants from getting to the border and creating more problems. Back in a minute. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So I want to take this time also to reiterate and remind people not to make donations to the RNC or, if you're Democrat, to the DNC, which is the Democrat National Committee, and the Republican National Committees. And I'm saying don't do that because one of the problems that we have in the United States of America is we do not get quality candidates. We do not get quality candidates for office, whether it's Congress or President of the United States. We do not get quality candidates. We don't because we are shut out of the process. Okay, it is the RNC and the DNC that decides who it is that they want to be candidates for office, and those are the people that they give money to. Those are the people whose campaigns they will finance. We have Donald Trump as president precisely because he was outside, or in spite of the fact, not because of, but in spite of the fact that he was outside the system. And I think that's an interesting standpoint, that we have one of the most effective presidents. Whether you like him or hate him, there's no doubt that he is effective, and more effective perhaps than any president in recent history. And I'm even speaking of Ronald Reagan. And that it's an interesting fact that he is one of the most effective presidents in recent history, and yet is not a product of the RNC. Ronald Reagan was, to a large degree. He was still considered, not liked by everybody in the RNC and the Republican National Committee because he was a conservative. But President Trump came from completely outside that system. And so I suggest to you that if we in the United States are going to have the best candidates possible, the people we really believe in, the people we really want to vote for, instead of having to go to the polls and hold our nose and vote between two bland, nothing, between the Bushes and the Clintons, or the Bushes and whoever else, Al Gore, some other bland, somebody that has some bland do-nothing, like what we have in Congress. The vast majority of Republicans that we have in Congress are do-nothing individuals. And the reasons that we have those folks is because we're always given a choice that really is no choice. And that's because the RNC and the DNC are the ones that are making the decisions who to give money to. And if you keep giving money to the RNC and to the DNC, you make them rich, you put them in charge, in power, and it's going to be much more difficult, if not impossible, to get quality candidates. One of the things you have to watch out for, I get emails all the time for a particular candidate. And again, what I want to reiterate too is, if you're going to give money, and which you should do, give money to a specific campaign. But beware that a lot of times the RNC will hide behind a candidate. There's a lot of emails I get supposedly from Donald Trump, But when I look at the email and I look at the fine print, it's not from Donald Trump. It's from the RNC. So be careful with that. Make some inquiries and find out who you have to give to a particular campaign. If you want to give to the re-election of President Trump, then find out who's running that and how to give directly to his campaign rather than giving to the RNC. And so hopefully if we can, there's another way, it's another way of draining the swamp. Okay, if the RNC doesn't have any money to give to its candidates, that means you and I have more of a say in politics and have more of a say about who it is that we're going to be asked to vote for. So, who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is not just political but cultural as well. They are patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments instead of predictions, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They are consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. They are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.